In the sweltering heat of 1955 Texas, one woman's kindness would become her curse, and her family's love would prove deadlier than any stranger's hatred. The October sun pressed down on Beaumont like a furnace, turning the air thick with petroleum and promise. Oil derricks stretched across the horizon, their mechanical arms pumping black gold from beneath the earth while train whistles carried across the Neches River, a symphony of industry that never slept. The smell of crude oil mixed with the first hints of autumn, creating an atmosphere unique to East Texas, where fortunes rose from the ground and dreams took shape in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Baptist Hospital stood like a weathered sentinel on Pearl Street, its red brick facade darkened by decades of oil field dust. Through the third-floor windows of the maternity ward, warm lights spilled into the gathering dusk, casting long shadows across empty corridors that would soon echo with footsteps heading home. Margaret Collins moved between the hospital beds with practiced grace, her white uniform crisp despite 12 hours of constant motion. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet confidence that made patients trust her immediately. Mothers reached for her hand during difficult moments, and children stopped their crying when she hummed old hymns her grandmother had taught her back in Tyler. "Nurse Collins," whispered Mrs. Henderson from bed 3. "The baby hasn't moved much today." Maggie placed her stethoscope against the swollen belly, listening carefully before offering a reassuring smile. "Strong heartbeat. Your little one is just saving energy for the grand entrance." The woman's relief was immediate, visible in the way her shoulders relaxed against the pillows. This was Maggie's gift, not just medical knowledge, but the ability to transform fear into hope with nothing more than presence and truth. Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Long day, Collins. You should head home. Just finishing rounds." Maggie adjusted Mrs. Henderson's blanket. "Mrs. Patterson in room 7 needs her medication adjusted, and the Rodriguez baby will be fine until morning." The doctor's expression softened. He'd worked with Maggie for 3 years, long enough to know her dedication bordered on exhaustion. Even angels need rest. The nickname had followed her since her first week at Baptist Hospital. Maggie understood why. She'd grown up in Tyler watching her mother tend to neighbors during illness, learning that healing required more than medicine. Her family's farm had struggled through the Depression, but her parents had never turned away someone in need. That same instinct lived in Maggie now, stronger than ambition or self-preservation. Her apartment on Pearl Street occupied the second floor of Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, 8 blocks from the hospital. The walk took 15 minutes, time Maggie used to decompress from each day's challenges and compose mental letters to her parents. Tonight felt different, though. Tension had been building in the maternity ward for weeks, ever since Dr. Morrison from the oil company started asking questions about medical supplies and patient records. The boarding house smelled of Mrs. Hartwell's evening pot roast and furniture polish. Maggie's room was small but comfortable, floral wallpaper that reminded her of her mother's garden, a single window overlooking the street, and a writing desk where she spent evenings crafting letters home to Tyler. "Dear Mama and Daddy," she would write, "the work here continues to challenge and reward me. Today I helped deliver twins, healthy boys who arrived 20 minutes apart, as if they'd planned their entrance for maximum drama." She never mentioned the other work, the women who appeared at her door after midnight, desperate and frightened. The wives of oil executives and the daughters of prominent families who needed help that respectable doctors wouldn't provide. These women found their way to Maggie through whispered recommendations, and she'd never turned one away. Her younger brother Sam visited every few weeks, usually when his latest job had ended or his luck at cards had turned sour. Maggie had supported his education after high school, sending money for trade school and helping him find work around Beaumont. Their relationship remained close despite his occasional lapses in judgment, gambling debts, arguments with supervisors, the restlessness that seemed to follow him everywhere. "You're too good to people, Maggie," he'd told her during his last visit. "They take advantage of your nature." Perhaps he was right, but Maggie had learned from their mother that kindness wasn't weakness. It was choice, made again and again despite the risks. The hospital's evening shift change brought its familiar rhythm. Departing nurses gathering their belongings, night staff settling into routines that would carry them toward dawn. Maggie completed her final rounds, checking on new mothers and ensuring pain medications were properly recorded. Room 9 held her youngest patient, barely 18, unmarried, and terrified. The girl had arrived 3 days earlier in labor, alone except for an older woman who disappeared once the delivery was complete. No family had visited, no friends had called. Nurse Collins. The girl's voice was barely audible. "Could you sit with me for a minute?" Maggie pulled a chair beside the bed. The baby slept peacefully in its bassinet, unaware of the complicated world it had entered. "I don't know how to thank you," the girl continued. "Not just for tonight, but for everything. For not asking questions. For helping when others wouldn't." Maggie felt her chest tighten. They'd been careful, conversations in whispers, meetings after regular hours, payments made discreetly. But in a town like Beaumont, secrets had a way of surfacing. "You don't need to thank me for doing my job." It was more than that. The girl reached for Maggie's hand. "You saved my life. Without your help earlier this year, I never would have." She glanced toward the sleeping infant. "Thank you for everything, especially, you know." The words hung between them like a confession. Maggie's training told her to deflect, to maintain professional distance. But she saw herself in this girl's eyes. The fear, the gratitude, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would offer help without judgment. What she didn't see was the figure standing just outside the doorway, listening to every word. Maggie squeezed the girl's hand gently before standing. "Get some rest. Tomorrow starts a new chapter." The corridor stretched before her as she gathered her belongings from the nurse's station. Her footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors, the sound amplifying in the growing quiet. The night felt different somehow, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. What would you do if helping others put your own life at risk? The question had no simple answer, but Maggie had made her choice long ago. Some people were born to heal, regardless of the cost. As she reached the hospital's main entrance, Maggie paused to adjust her nursing cap, a ritual she'd maintained since graduation. The parking lot stretched empty before her, illuminated by a single streetlight that flickered against the October darkness. She didn't notice the car idling in the shadows, or the figure watching her from behind the wheel. October 13th, 1955, was ending, but for Margaret Collins, time had already stopped. October 13th, 1955, 7:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, Maggie Collins would vanish forever, leaving behind only questions that would haunt a community for 70 years. The hospital clock tower chimed 7 times, its brass bells cutting through the evening air as Maggie Collins stood at the nurse's station, her hands trembling slightly as she organized patient charts. The tremor was barely visible, but Ruth Morgan noticed everything. As night supervisor, she'd learned to read the subtle signs that separated routine shifts from crisis moments. "You all right, honey?" Ruth approached the station, her sensible shoes silent against the polished floor. "You've been checking that schedule every 10 minutes. Maggie's smile felt forced. "Just making sure everything's covered for the night shift." She glanced toward the telephone again, the same anxious gesture she'd repeated throughout the afternoon. The phone calls had started during lunch break, 3 separate conversations that left Maggie increasingly agitated. Ruth had overheard fragments from the hallway. "I told you, I can't. No, that's not how this works. I have patients who need me." Each call had ended abruptly, leaving Maggie staring at the receiver as if it might ring again. Security guard Jimmy Patterson completed his evening rounds, checking doors and windows with the methodical precision of a man who'd served 2 tours in the Pacific. At 63, he possessed the kind of awareness that came from surviving places where carelessness meant death. Tonight, something felt off. He'd watched Maggie throughout her shift, noticed how she jumped when doors slammed, how she kept glancing toward the windows, how her usual confident stride had developed a hesitant quality. When young Thomas Jenkins delivered a note from the front desk around 4 o'clock, Maggie's face had drained of color. Her hands shook so badly she could barely unfold the paper. "Evening, Nurse Collins," Jimmy said as their paths crossed near the maternity ward. "Everything secure up here?" "Of course." Her response came too quickly. Why wouldn't it be? The question hung between them awkwardly. Jimmy had known Maggie for 3 years. She wasn't the type to ask defensive questions or avoid eye contact. Something had spooked her badly. 15 minutes later, Dr. Harrison emerged from his office, medical bag in hand. The day shift was officially ending, though Maggie remained at her station, organizing supplies that were already perfectly arranged. "Big plans for the weekend?" he asked, the kind of casual conversation that filled transition moments. Maggie paused, her hands stilling on a stack of medication records. "Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone." The comment struck Dr. Harrison as odd, cryptic in a way that didn't match Maggie's usual directness. But before he could respond, she'd gathered her belongings and headed toward the stairwell. What she left behind would puzzle investigators for decades. Her nursing cap, sitting abandoned on the counter. Maggie never forgot her cap. It was part of her identity, as essential as her stethoscope or the small silver cross she wore on a chain beneath her uniform. Ruth Morgan found it 20 minutes later, neatly folded beside a patient chart. The discovery sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. Outside, fog rolled in from the Gulf of Mexico, turning familiar streets into alien landscapes. Streetlights became hazy beacons floating in gray mist, and the rhythmic sound of oil pumps created an industrial heartbeat that seemed to pulse with unusual intensity. Jimmy Patterson positioned himself near the main entrance, watching the parking lot through windows that were beginning to collect moisture. At 7:45, he saw Maggie exit through the double doors, her white uniform ghost-like in the thickening fog. She paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at the hospital with an expression he couldn't read from his vantage point. Then she walked toward Pearl Street, her figure growing smaller until the fog swallowed her completely. 8 blocks away, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell prepared her evening tea and settled into the chair by her front window, a ritual that had developed over 30 years of watching over her tenants. At 74, she possessed the sharp attention of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. Details mattered in her world. Maggie's routine was clockwork, 15 minutes from hospital to boarding house, arriving home between 8 and 8:10 depending on her pace and any stops along the way. Mrs. Hartwell could set her watch by the sound of those familiar footsteps on the front porch. By 8:15, concern began to creep into her thoughts. By 8:30, concern had transformed into worry. Maggie had never been late without calling ahead. She was considerate that way, understanding that an elderly landlady might fret over unexplained changes in routine. The fog outside had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall. Oil pumps continued their mechanical breathing in the distance, but the usual evening sounds, cars, voices, footsteps, seemed muffled and distant. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Hartwell climbed the stairs to Maggie's apartment and knocked softly. No response. She tried the handle and found it locked, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the complete silence from within. No radio, no movement, no sign of life. Back in her own apartment, Mrs. Hartwell tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps Maggie had stopped to help someone. That would be like her. Or maybe she'd encountered friends and lost track of time. But as the hours crawled past, rational explanations grew thinner. The memory that wouldn't leave her alone was from the previous Sunday. Raised voices from Maggie's apartment, angry words she couldn't quite make out, and the sound of someone leaving abruptly around 10 o'clock. Mrs. Hartwell had glimpsed a young man through her curtains, tall, dark-haired, moving with the quick stride of someone upset or frustrated. At midnight, Mrs. Hartwell reached for her telephone. Police department? This is Eleanor Hartwell on Pearl Street. I need to report a missing person. As she spoke to the dispatcher, explaining Maggie's reliable routine and growing concern over her absence, Mrs. Hartwell moved to her window for another look at the street. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing shapes that had been hidden for hours. Fresh tire tracks marked the alley behind the boarding house, deep grooves in the soft earth that hadn't been there that morning. Mrs. Hartwell had walked that alley every day for 5 years, checking her trash cans and tending to her small garden. These tracks were new. Her blood chilled as she noticed something else. Maggie's apartment window, the one facing the alley, stood slightly open. Maggie never left windows open. She was particular about security, especially on the ground level. "Ma'am, are you still there?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. "Yes, there's something else." Mrs. Hartwell pressed closer to her own window, straining to see through the remaining wisps of fog. A shadow moved across Maggie's window. Deliberate, searching, definitely human. Someone was inside the apartment. Have you ever had a feeling that something terrible was about to happen? That inexplicable certainty that comes without warning, turning ordinary moments into harbingers of catastrophe? Several people in Beaumont felt it that night. A collective unease that spread through the community like fog rolling in from the Gulf. Mrs. Hartwell's hands trembled as she gripped the telephone, watching the shadow move systematically through Maggie's rooms. Whoever was up there was looking for something specific, and they clearly weren't concerned about being discovered. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. Maggie Collins wasn't just missing. She was never coming home. When a good person disappears, a community searches. When that person holds dangerous secrets, some prefer she stays missing. Detective Bobby Wheeler arrived at the Pearl Street boarding house with the weary resignation of a man who'd handled too many missing person reports. At 42, he'd spent 18 years in law enforcement, first as a Marine military policeman in the Pacific, then 10 years working cases in East Texas. Experience had taught him that young women disappeared for predictable reasons: secret boyfriends, family troubles, or the simple desire to escape small-town expectations. Young girls run off all the time, he told Mrs. Hartwell as they climbed the stairs to Maggie's apartment. Usually turn up in Houston or Dallas within a week, married to some fellow their families wouldn't approve of. Mrs. Hartwell's expression suggested she found his dismissal insulting. Margaret Collins isn't that type of girl, detective. She's responsible, dedicated to her work. Something has happened to her. Wheeler had heard similar protests before. Families never wanted to believe their daughters capable of impulsive decisions or secret lives. But as Mrs. Hartwell unlocked Maggie's apartment door, his skepticism began to shift. The room told a story of interrupted routine. Half-eaten dinner sat on the small table, pot roast and green beans, still on the plate where someone had abandoned them mid-meal. Coffee had gone cold in a cup positioned next to an unfinished letter. Wheeler approached the writing desk, reading the careful script. Dear Mama and Daddy, the work here continues to challenge and reward me. Yesterday, I helped deliver twins, and I've been assisting with some important cases that require discretion. I can't say much in a letter, but I'm doing meaningful work helping women in need. The letter ended mid-sentence, as if Maggie had been interrupted or called away urgently. Wheeler's attention shifted to the dresser, where Maggie's purse sat undisturbed. Inside, he found $247 in cash, more money than most working people saw in 2 months. No woman planning to leave town would abandon that kind of security. She was very organized, Mrs. Hartwell observed, watching Wheeler examine the room. Everything had its place. Look at that closet, every dress arranged by color, shoes lined up perfectly. This isn't someone who packed hastily. The suitcase remained in its usual spot beneath the bed, filled with off-season clothing. Maggie's nursing uniforms hung pressed and ready in the wardrobe. Personal items, jewelry, photographs, her Bible, occupied their designated spaces. Wheeler had seen enough crime scenes to recognize the difference between abandonment and interruption. This apartment belonged to someone who expected to return. News of Maggie's disappearance spread through Beaumont like wildfire. By morning, the hospital had organized search parties composed of nurses, orderlies, and administrative staff. They combed the riverbanks and checked abandoned buildings, calling Maggie's name until their voices grew hoarse. Oil field workers volunteered their lunch breaks to search industrial sites and storage facilities. These men understood dangerous work and dangerous places. If Maggie had encountered trouble near the refineries or drilling sites, they would find evidence. The response from Beaumont's wealthy families proved more complicated. Mayor Henderson offered a $50 reward for information leading to Maggie's safe return. Oil executive Charles Morrison pledged $25. Police Chief Thompson announced that the department would dedicate extra resources to the investigation. But Wheeler noticed reluctance beneath their public support. When he interviewed prominent families about their connections to Maggie, conversations grew stilted and uncomfortable. They praised her nursing skills while deflecting questions about personal interactions or recent contact. Sam Collins emerged as the face of family grief, giving tearful interviews to the Beaumont Enterprise. The photograph accompanying the story showed a handsome young man with dark hair and earnest eyes, pleading for his sister's safe return. "Maggie is the best person I know," he told reporters. "She'd give her last dollar to help someone in need. If she's in trouble, it's because she was trying to help somebody else." Wheeler found Sam's media presence curious. Most family members in crisis avoided reporters, preferring privacy during emotional turmoil. Sam seemed comfortable with attention, presenting himself as both grieving brother and family spokesperson. The first significant clues emerged through systematic interviews. Wheeler possessed the methodical patience of a career investigator, asking the same questions repeatedly until patterns emerged. Pharmacist Robert Jenkins mentioned unusual purchases charged to Maggie's account, medical supplies that seemed excessive for personal use, bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, more than a nurse would need at home, but she always paid promptly. Railroad worker Frank Morrison remembered seeing a woman matching Maggie's description near the Southern Pacific tracks around 8 o'clock on October 13th. She seemed upset, like she was waiting for someone. Kept looking toward the road. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Maggie with an unidentified man during recent weeks, tall, well-dressed, always meeting in discreet locations. These sightings troubled Wheeler because they suggested a relationship Maggie had kept carefully hidden. The breakthrough came during his third interview with Dr. Harrison. Wheeler had learned to press beyond initial responses, understanding that people often withheld information not from malice, but from uncertainty about its relevance. "Were there any irregularities in medical supply inventory recently?" Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there were some discrepancies. Nothing major, but certain items seemed to disappear faster than usual usage would suggest." "What kind of items?" "Antiseptic, surgical supplies, pain medication, the kind of materials used for women's medical procedures." Wheeler understood immediately. In 1955 Texas, women's medical procedures carried implications that could destroy careers and reputations. If Maggie had been providing such services, she'd been operating in extremely dangerous territory. Further investigation revealed the scope of Maggie's secret work. Through careful questioning and document review, Wheeler discovered a pattern of after-hours activity at the hospital, unusual supply usage, and connections to women from Beaumont's most prominent families. The 1950s were a different time with different rules, when helping women in desperate situations meant risking everything: career, reputation, freedom. What do you think about people who break unjust laws to help others? The question had no simple answers, but it was becoming central to understanding Maggie's disappearance. Wheeler's investigation led him back to Maggie's apartment for a more thorough search. As he examined the room systematically, he noticed something he'd missed initially: a loose floorboard near the window that creaked when he stepped on it. Prying up the board revealed a hidden compartment containing medical supplies and a notebook filled with coded entries. As Wheeler deciphered the abbreviations and symbols, names became clear: Henderson, Morrison, Thompson, daughters and wives of Beaumont's most powerful men. The implications struck him like a physical blow. Maggie hadn't just been helping anonymous women in desperate situations. She'd been treating the families of the mayor, police chief, and oil executives, people with everything to lose if their secrets became public. Wheeler was still processing this revelation when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was approaching the apartment, moving with purpose rather than curiosity. He quickly replaced the floorboard and positioned himself behind the door, hand resting on his service weapon. The footsteps paused outside the apartment. A key turned in the lock. Wheeler held his breath as the door opened and someone entered, moving directly toward the area where he'd discovered the hidden compartment. Whoever this was knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. The footsteps approached his hiding spot with terrifying certainty. Some secrets are worth killing for. Others are worth dying to protect. In 1955 Beaumont, Maggie Collins had stumbled into both kinds. Wheeler's hand remained steady on his service weapon as the apartment door swung open. The figure that entered moved with confident familiarity, heading directly toward the loose floorboard without hesitation. Only when Wheeler stepped from behind the door did the intruder freeze. "Sam Collins." Wheeler kept his voice level, professional. "Interesting that you'd know exactly where to look." Sam straightened slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence that seemed rehearsed. Detective Wheeler, I was hoping to find something that might help locate Maggie. Family items, maybe a diary or letters. And you thought to check under loose floorboards? I helped her move in 3 years ago. Noticed the board was loose then. She used it to store valuables. Sam's explanation came smoothly, but Wheeler caught the slight tremor in his voice. I figured if she was hiding anything important. Wheeler studied Sam's face, noting the lack of surprise at finding the hidden compartment, the way his eyes had gone immediately to the right spot. Most people would call police before conducting their own search. I didn't think you'd find it significant. Just family mementos, probably. But Wheeler had already examined the contents. Medical supplies and coded patient records that represented far more than sentimental keepsakes. Sam's casual dismissal only deepened his suspicion. Over the following days, Wheeler's investigation revealed the staggering scope of Maggie's secret work. Through careful interviews and document analysis, he reconstructed an underground network that had operated beneath Beaumont's respectable surface for months. Maggie had been helping women with complications from difficult pregnancies when official medical care proved inadequate or unavailable. She'd treated women's health issues that male doctors either dismissed or refused to address. Most dangerously, she'd provided procedures that were illegal but medically necessary, along with birth control information in an era when such knowledge was forbidden. The patient interviews required delicate handling. Wheeler understood that these women risked everything by speaking with him. Reputations, marriages, and social standing could be destroyed by mere association with such activities. Sarah Henderson, the mayor's 19-year-old daughter, agreed to meet Wheeler only after he promised complete confidentiality. She sat rigidly in the municipal building's conference room, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maggie saved my life," Sarah said finally. "I was hemorrhaging after a procedure went wrong. The regular doctor said he couldn't help me, that I'd brought it on myself. Maggie treated me without judgment, without questions." Elizabeth Morrison, wife of oil executive Charles Morrison, met Wheeler at his office after hours. Her hands shook as she described a dangerous pregnancy that threatened her life. "My husband wanted another child, but the doctors said it would kill me. They wouldn't help because Charles wanted an heir. Maggie provided alternatives. Safe alternatives." Maria Santos, a young Mexican-American woman, spoke through tears about her inability to afford proper medical care during her pregnancy. Maggie charged nothing. Nothing. She said every woman deserved safe treatment regardless of ability to pay. The most shocking interview came from Grace Thompson, the police chief's wife. She revealed that Maggie had literally saved her life during a miscarriage that became dangerously complicated. "My husband doesn't know. Can't know. It would destroy his career if people learned his wife had sought unconventional treatment. But I would have died without Maggie's help." Each conversation revealed the impossible stakes these women faced. In 1955 Texas, unmarried pregnancy meant complete social ostracism. Birth control was illegal and considered immoral. Women who sought such help were branded as loose or criminal. Careers, marriages, and family reputations hung in the balance. Wheeler began to understand why someone might want Maggie to disappear. Her knowledge represented a threat to Beaumont's most powerful families. Information that could destroy lives and careers if it became public. During this period, Sam Collins remained visibly involved in the search efforts, giving regular interviews to local papers and organizing volunteer search parties. But Wheeler noticed troubling patterns in Sam's behavior. He asked specific questions about the investigation's progress, not the general inquiries of a concerned brother, but detailed requests about evidence and witness statements. He volunteered information no one had asked for, offering theories about Maggie's disappearance that seemed designed to redirect attention. Most suspiciously, he suggested areas where search parties shouldn't waste their time. "No point checking the industrial sites near the railroad," Sam told a group of oil workers. Maggie never went to that part of town. Family members mentioned Sam's recent financial troubles during casual conversations. His aunt revealed that he'd been asking Maggie for money to cover gambling debts. His former employer described arguments about missed work and unreliability. The breakthrough came when railroad worker Chuck Morrison made a grisly discovery near the Southern Pacific tracks. Wrapped around a railroad spike, he found Maggie's blood-stained nursing uniform, torn, dirty, and bearing clear evidence of violence. The location was significant. It was exactly in the area where Sam had suggested search parties avoid looking. Wheeler arranged for immediate forensic analysis using the limited techniques available in 1955. The blood type matched Maggie's records from the hospital. Fabric tears suggested a violent struggle rather than accidental damage. The railroad spike placement appeared intentional. Someone had deliberately wrapped the uniform around it, ensuring eventual discovery. The timing raised additional questions. Railroad workers passed this location daily. Why hadn't the uniform been found earlier? Had it been placed there recently, or had environmental factors concealed it until now? Wheeler's suspicions about Sam crystallized during a routine verification of alibis. Sam had claimed to be in Houston with friends the night Maggie disappeared, visiting gambling establishments and staying overnight. But when Wheeler contacted Houston police for verification, the alibi crumbled. No one at the gambling halls remembered seeing Sam that night. The friends he'd named had no record of his visit. Most damaging, a Beaumont resident had seen Sam arguing with someone in a car behind Baptist Hospital at 8:15 p.m., 15 minutes after Maggie should have been safely home. When Wheeler confronted Sam with these discrepancies, his demeanor changed dramatically. The helpful, grieving brother facade disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. "I want a lawyer," Sam said, ending the interview immediately. Family members are often the first suspects in missing person cases, and for good reason. Statistics showed that women were most likely to be harmed by someone they knew and trusted. Have you ever suspected someone close to you of hiding something dark? The possibility that love could mask deadly intentions challenged everything people believed about family bonds. Wheeler now faced a horrible possibility, that Maggie Collins had been murdered by the very brother she'd supported and trusted. Her kindness had made her vulnerable to someone who should have protected her. The investigation was about to take a much darker turn. But as Wheeler prepared to obtain an arrest warrant, he received disturbing news. Sam Collins had disappeared from Beaumont, leaving behind only a note claiming he needed time to grieve privately. His sudden departure suggested consciousness of guilt and raised terrifying questions about what else he might be hiding. The search for Maggie Collins was becoming a manhunt for her own brother. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood runs cold with jealousy, greed, and deadly secrets that tear families apart forever. The train to Tyler carried Wheeler through East Texas farmland that stretched endless and flat under November skies. He'd made this journey to understand the Collins family history, to discover what had transformed sibling love into something capable of murder. The answers he found would challenge everything people believed about family bonds. Wheeler's first stop was the Collins family farm, where Maggie and Sam's parents still struggled to make ends meet on 40 acres of cotton and corn. Martha Collins met him at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup as she spoke about her children with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years defending difficult truths. "Sam was always the charming one," she said, staring out the window toward fields that seemed to stretch forever. "Could talk his way out of trouble, make people laugh, convince you to loan him money even when you knew better. But Maggie earned everything she got." The family dynamics became clear through Martha's careful words. Maggie had been the golden child, intelligent, ambitious, determined to rise above their circumstances. She'd worked multiple jobs to save money for nursing school, studied by kerosene lamp when electricity bills went unpaid, and sent money home even when she could barely afford it. Sam had lived in his sister's shadow, resentful of her achievements while depending on her success. When Maggie moved to Beaumont and found steady work at the hospital, she'd begun supporting Sam financially, paying for his trade school education, helping him find jobs, covering his debts when his charm couldn't. The letters she sent home lately. Martha's voice trailed off. She was worried about Sam. Said he was asking for more money than she could spare, getting involved with dangerous people in Houston. She felt responsible for him, like she always had. Wheeler interviewed neighbors and childhood acquaintances, uncovering a pattern of behavior that painted Sam in increasingly dark colors. Former employer Jake Morrison described Sam as charming but unreliable, always ready with excuses when work went undone, quick to blame others for his failures. He had this way of making you feel sorry for him, Morrison explained. Always had some sad story about why he couldn't pay back money he'd borrowed, why he'd missed work, why nothing was ever his fault. But after a while, you realized the problems followed him everywhere. More disturbing were the accounts from several women in Tyler who remembered uncomfortable encounters with Sam. Sarah Beth Williams, now married with children, described an incident from 5 years earlier when Sam had cornered her at a church social, demanding to know why she'd turned down his invitation to dinner. He got angry when I said no, really angry. Started saying things about how I thought I was too good for him, how all the pretty girls only cared about money. It scared me enough that I told my father. Wheeler's investigation revealed that Sam's gambling debts totaled over $500, a staggering sum in 1955, equivalent to several months' wages for most working people. He owed money to dangerous people in Houston's underground gambling scene, men who'd made their displeasure known through increasingly violent threats. According to sources in Houston's gambling establishments, Sam had been given a final deadline: pay up by October 15th or face serious consequences. The timing was significant, just 2 days after Maggie's disappearance. Wheeler discovered that Sam knew details about Maggie's financial situation that most siblings wouldn't possess. He'd helped her set up her bank account when she first moved to Beaumont, knew about her life insurance policy, understood exactly how much money she'd saved. Her life insurance named Sam as sole beneficiary, enough to cover his debts and provide a fresh start. The confrontation that neighbors had overheard the Sunday before Maggie's disappearance could now be reconstructed through witness testimony. Mrs. Hartwell had heard raised voices around 9 o'clock, followed by the sound of someone leaving angrily. Wheeler interviewed the boarding house tenant who lived below Maggie's apartment. Thomas Reed, a railway clerk, had heard enough of the argument to piece together its substance. The man was demanding money, saying he was in serious trouble. The woman, Miss Collins, kept saying she couldn't afford what he was asking. Then he got threatening, said something about people knowing her business if she didn't help him. She told him to leave and never come back. The medical evidence raised disturbing new possibilities. The blood found on Maggie's uniform suggested significant injury, but not necessarily fatal bleeding. This meant Maggie might have been alive when she was moved from the initial attack location. Had Sam panicked after striking her? Had he disposed of her body, even though she might have survived with proper medical attention? Wheeler consulted with Dr. James Morrison, one of the few psychiatrists practicing in East Texas. Dr. Morrison reviewed the case files and provided psychological insights that chilled Wheeler to the bone. Sibling rivalry combined with financial desperation creates a particularly dangerous psychological cocktail, Dr. Morrison explained. The subject shows classic narcissistic patterns, charming publicly but manipulative privately. He spent his life competing with his sister's success while depending on her generosity. Dr. Morrison noted that Sam's helpful behavior after Maggie's disappearance fit established patterns of guilt and deflection. Killers often insert themselves into investigations, partly to monitor progress and partly to satisfy psychological needs for attention and control. The timing suggested a crime of opportunity rather than premeditation. Sam had likely gone to Maggie's apartment that night hoping to pressure her into providing money. When she refused, his desperation and resentment had exploded into violence. Sibling relationships can be complicated, shaped by years of comparison, competition, and complex family dynamics. Have you ever felt overshadowed by a brother or sister? The bonds that should protect us can sometimes become chains that drag us toward darkness when jealousy and desperation take control. Wheeler returned to Beaumont with enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for Sam's room at the boarding house where he'd been staying. The landlord, nervous about police attention, led Wheeler and 2 deputies to a second-floor room that Sam had abandoned without paying rent. The room was sparse. A few changes of clothes, personal items, and a suitcase that seemed packed for hasty departure. But Wheeler's careful search revealed more damning evidence hidden beneath loose floorboards in the corner. Wrapped in a handkerchief was Maggie's nursing pin, the small silver cross she wore every day, the one she never removed even when off duty. The pin was covered in what appeared to be dried blood, dark stains that had never been cleaned. More devastating was the letter Wheeler found tucked inside a Bible, written in Sam's handwriting but never sent, addressed to a known gambling contact in Houston. The problem is solved. She won't be causing any more trouble. Payment will arrive as promised within the week. Sorry for the delay, but family matters required careful handling. The letter was dated October 14, 1955, the day after Maggie's disappearance. Wheeler stared at the evidence, feeling sick. The letter essentially confessed to murder, written with the cold calculation of someone who'd planned to profit from his sister's death. Sam hadn't killed Maggie in a moment of passion. He'd murdered her deliberately, then calmly planned to use her life insurance money to pay his gambling debts. As Wheeler sealed the evidence, he realized they were no longer searching for a missing person. They were building a murder case against a man who'd killed the one person who'd never stopped believing in him. The Collins family's tragedy was complete. The golden child was dead, and the troubled son had become her killer. But Sam Collins had vanished, and Wheeler faced a new challenge, hunting down a murderer who'd had a head start and nothing left to lose. Truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it. For Sam Collins, 69 years wasn't nearly long enough. Detective Maria Santos pulled into the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department parking lot on a crisp January morning in 2023, carrying a box of evidence that had collected dust for nearly 7 decades. As the newest member of the East Texas Cold Case Task Force, she'd been assigned the Collins file, a missing person case from 1955 that had never been officially closed. What she didn't know was that her own existence was connected to this case in ways that defied coincidence. The evidence room held fragments of a life interrupted, Maggie Collins' blood-stained nursing uniform, carefully preserved in plastic since 1955, hair samples from her brush, Detective Wheeler's meticulous case notes, typed on carbon paper and filed with the precision of a man who believed every detail mattered. Santos had grown up hearing family stories about a nurse who'd helped her great-grandmother during a difficult pregnancy, saving both mother and child when no other medical care was available. Only now, reading through Wheeler's files, did she realize that nurse had been Maggie Collins. Modern forensic science offered tools that 1955 investigators could never have imagined. Santos began with DNA analysis of the blood found on Maggie's uniform, extracting genetic material that had remained stable despite decades of storage. The profile that emerged told a story Wheeler could never have uncovered. The blood didn't belong to Maggie Collins. Santos ran the DNA profile through genealogical databases that connected millions of family trees across generations. The search algorithms worked through countless genetic markers, building family connections that stretched back centuries. When the results appeared on her computer screen, Santos felt her pulse quicken. The blood belonged to someone in the Collins family line, specifically, a male relative whose DNA matched samples in the database. Cross-referencing with public records and family histories led to an inescapable conclusion. Sam Collins, now 89 years old and living at Shady Oaks retirement home in Vidor, Texas. Santos spent weeks building her case using techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to Wheeler's generation. Digital reconstruction software allowed her to create three-dimensional models of the 1955 crime scenes using old photographs and witness testimony. Advanced psychological profiling analyzed Sam's documented behavior patterns, revealing insights that supported Wheeler's original suspicions. The surviving witnesses were fewer now. Most had passed away or suffered memory loss that made their testimony unreliable. But several people remained who could provide crucial pieces of the puzzle. Grace Thompson, now 94 and living in an assisted care facility, had carried her secret for nearly 70 years. When Santos interviewed her, the old woman's eyes filled with tears. "Maggie saved my life," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never told anyone, not even after she disappeared. But Sam knew about her other work. He asked me questions that made me uncomfortable, like he was fishing for information he could use somehow." Thomas Jenkins, the former hospital orderly, remembered Sam's frequent visits to Baptist Hospital in the weeks before Maggie's disappearance. At 91, his memory remained sharp for events from his youth. He was always hanging around, asking questions about schedules and procedures. Said he was worried about his sister working too hard, but it felt like he was studying the place, learning things he shouldn't know. The most revealing testimony came from Eleanor Hartwell's daughter, now in her 70s. Her mother had suspected Sam, but never felt safe speaking openly in 1955. Mama saw him leaving Maggie's apartment that Sunday night before she disappeared, the daughter revealed. She heard the argument, saw him storm out. But when Maggie went missing, Sam became the grieving brother, and Mama was afraid no one would believe her suspicions. Santos tracked Sam's life from 1955 to the present, uncovering a carefully constructed existence built on lies. He'd left Beaumont within 6 months of Maggie's disappearance, claiming the memories were too painful. The trail led to Houston, where he'd worked various jobs and gradually established a new identity. He'd married twice, first to a woman who died young in what appeared to be an accident, then to a widow with children who provided instant family respectability. His 3 biological children knew him as a devoted father who spoke lovingly of his deceased sister Maggie. The cruelest irony was that he'd named his eldest daughter Margaret in honor of his beloved sister. For 68 years, he'd maintained the facade of the grieving brother, attending annual memorial services for Maggie until his health declined. Santos interviewed Sam's children, now adults with families of their own. Their descriptions revealed a man haunted by secrets he could never share. Dad had terrible nightmares his whole life, his son Robert explained. He'd wake up screaming, but he never talked about what scared him. And he was obsessively protective of us kids, especially my sisters. Wouldn't let them go anywhere alone, always worried something might happen to them. His daughter Margaret described a father consumed by guilt over unnamed past mistakes. In recent years, he'd talk about wanting to clear his conscience and make amends for things he'd done wrong. We thought he meant business dealings or family disagreements. We never imagined. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a man who'd spent nearly 70 years carrying the weight of murder. His protective behavior toward his daughters suggested guilt over killing his own sister. His insomnia and nightmares indicated trauma that had never healed. Justice delayed isn't always justice denied, but it raises complex questions about accountability and time. Do you believe people should be held responsible for crimes committed decades ago? Some argue that enough time has passed, that an 89-year-old man poses no threat to society. Others insist that murder has no statute of limitations, that victims deserve justice regardless of how much time has elapsed. Santos believed in justice, regardless of time. Maggie Collins deserved someone to speak for her, even 68 years after her death. On a gray February morning, Santos and her team arrived at Shady Oaks retirement home with an arrest warrant. The facility's staff expressed shock. Sam Collins was known as a quiet, polite resident who kept to himself and rarely caused trouble. He's been talking about wanting to set things right lately, his nurse mentioned as they walked down the hallway. Almost like he's been waiting for something. Sam's room was small but comfortable, furnished with photographs of family and a few personal belongings that represented nearly 9 decades of life. He sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the East Texas landscape that had been his home for so long. When Santos entered the room, Sam turned toward her with eyes that held no surprise, no fear, only a strange kind of relief. His first words weren't denial or confusion, but a simple question that confirmed everything she'd suspected. Is it finally time to tell the truth about what happened to Maggie? Santos felt a chill run down her spine. After 68 years of lies, Sam Collins was ready to confess. But as she began to read him his rights, she wondered what other secrets he'd been carrying all these years, and whether the truth about Maggie's death was only the beginning of a much darker story. The web of lies that had protected Sam Collins for nearly 7 decades was finally unraveling. But some truths, once revealed, opened doors to even deeper mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about justice, family, and the price of keeping deadly secrets. After 69 years of silence, Sam Collins was ready to speak. But the truth he revealed was even darker than anyone had imagined. The interrogation room at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office felt smaller than usual, with 3 people crowded around a metal table that had witnessed countless confessions over the decades. Sam Collins sat with his hands folded, appearing frail but alert, his 89-year-old frame dwarfed by the institutional furniture. Detective Santos positioned herself across from him, while FBI agent Robert Martinez, a specialist in cold cases, operated the recording equipment. "Mr. Collins," Santos began, "you indicated you're ready to discuss the events of October 13th, 1955. Before we proceed, I want to ensure you understand your rights." Sam waved dismissively. "I've been waiting 68 years to tell this story, Detective. I'm not interested in lawyers or legal technicalities. I want to get this right." His voice carried the weight of decades, each word measured as if he'd rehearsed this moment countless times. Santos activated the recorder and nodded for him to begin. "I discovered what Maggie was doing in late September," Sam said, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the interrogation room walls. "Followed her one night after she left the hospital. Watched her meet with women in shadows, treating them in that little clinic she'd set up. Rich women, important women, wives and daughters of men who ran this town." He paused, a bitter smile crossing his face. "My first thought wasn't concern for my sister's safety. It was opportunity. These women would pay anything to keep their secrets buried." Santos felt her stomach tighten as Sam described approaching Maggie with his blackmail scheme. Instead of being proud of her helping others, he'd seen only potential profit. When Maggie refused to participate and threatened to cut off his financial support entirely, Sam's desperation had transformed into cold calculation. "She thought she was so noble," Sam continued, his voice hardening. "Helping women in need, risking everything for strangers while her own brother faced threats from men who would break his legs if he didn't pay his debts. I tried to reason with her, explain that we could help these women and help ourselves too." The night of October 13th had unfolded with methodical precision. Sam waited behind Baptist Hospital with a tire iron he'd brought, just to scare her into cooperation. When Maggie emerged from her shift, he'd confronted her one final time. "She told me she'd rather see me beaten by gamblers than become an extortionist," Sam said, his voice flat with remembered anger. "Said she'd expose my debts to our parents and the whole community if I didn't leave her alone." That's when I lost control. The violence had been swift and brutal. Sam struck Maggie with the tire iron, watching her fall against the concrete steps. Blood pooled from her scalp wound, staining her white uniform as she lay motionless. "I thought I'd killed her," Sam admitted. "Wrapped her in her own nursing uniform and carried her to my car. But then," his voice trailed off, and for the first time since entering the room, he showed genuine emotion, not remorse, but something that might have been regret. Agent Martinez leaned forward. "What happened then, Sam?" She woke up. The words came out as a whisper. "Halfway to the river, Maggie regained consciousness. Started begging for her life, promising to forget everything, even offering to help with the blackmail scheme she'd refused before." Santos felt nauseous as Sam described his sister's desperate pleas. Maggie had looked at him with trusting eyes, the same eyes that had looked up to him when they were children playing in Tyler's cotton fields. But Sam's decision had already been made. "I couldn't risk her changing her mind later," he said with chilling logic. "Couldn't risk her talking to police or confessing to our parents. She knew too much about what I'd planned." At a secluded spot along the Neches River, Sam had strangled his sister with her own stethoscope. The symbol of her dedication to healing became the instrument of her death. He weighted her body with railroad spikes and pushed it into the deepest part of the river, watching it disappear beneath the dark water. The cover-up had been elaborate and calculated. Sam returned to plant evidence at various locations, confusing investigators about timeline and location. He coached himself on how to act like a grieving brother, studying his own reflection until he could produce tears on command. "I inserted myself into the investigation," Sam continued with disturbing pride. "Volunteered for search parties, gave interviews to reporters, monitored what police were discovering. When things got too intense, I left Beaumont claiming the memories were too painful." Throughout his confession, Sam displayed psychological patterns that chilled both investigators. He showed no genuine remorse for murdering Maggie, only regret at being caught after so many years. His resentment about living in her shadow had festered for decades, and he still rationalized that she'd brought it on herself by refusing to help him. Most disturbing was his pride in the deception. For nearly 70 years, he'd maintained the facade of the grieving brother, even naming his daughter after his victim. He'd attended memorial services, comforted his parents, and accepted community sympathy while knowing exactly where Maggie's body lay. Based on Sam's detailed confession, authorities organized an extensive search of the Neches River. Sonar equipment and underwater cameras focused on the area he described, though industrial activity and natural changes had significantly altered the landscape over 7 decades. The search would take weeks, but Sam's confession provided enough detail to eventually locate physical evidence. After 68 years, Maggie Collins might finally be brought home. Some crimes are so shocking they make us question human nature itself. What drives a person to kill their own family member? The capacity for evil often exists closest to home, masked by familiar faces and justified by twisted logic that transforms love into possession, support into obligation, and family bonds into deadly chains. As Sam finished recounting the murder, Santos thought the confession was complete. She began organizing her notes when Sam raised one trembling hand. "Detective," he said quietly, "you think you know the whole story, but you don't." Santos looked up, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. "Maggie wasn't my only victim," Sam continued, his voice gaining strength. "There were others, women who threatened to expose what I knew about the underground clinic. The good citizens of Beaumont have been living with a serial killer in their midst for 70 years. The interrogation room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the mechanical whir of the recording equipment. Santos stared at Sam Collins, realizing that the confession she'd thought would close a decades-old case had instead opened the door to something far more horrifying. The murder of Maggie Collins wasn't an isolated act of family violence. It was the beginning of a killing spree that had continued for years, hidden beneath the facade of a grieving brother who'd learned that murder could solve problems when properly executed. Sam Collins wasn't just a killer. He was a serial killer whose crimes had gone undetected for nearly 7 decades. One sister's murder was just the beginning. Sam Collins had spent 70 years perfecting the art of making people disappear. The revelation that Sam Collins was responsible for multiple deaths transformed the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office into a command center for one of the largest cold case investigations in Texas history. Detective Santos found herself coordinating with FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit specialists as the case expanded from a single murder to a potential serial killing investigation spanning decades. Agent Martinez arranged for additional resources while Santos tried to process the magnitude of what Sam had revealed. The elderly man sitting across from her wasn't just a killer. He was a predator who'd spent nearly 70 years eliminating anyone who threatened his carefully constructed life. "Tell me about Linda Patterson," Santos said, referring to her notes as Sam continued his methodical confession. Sam's eyes grew distant, as if accessing memories he'd kept locked away for decades. "Linda was a teacher, 24 years old. Pretty girl, taught at the elementary school near the railroad tracks. She saw me disposing of evidence one night in 1957, Maggie's stethoscope, and some other items I'd kept too long." Linda Patterson had been walking home from a school board meeting when she witnessed Sam burying objects near the Southern Pacific tracks. She'd approached him, concerned and curious, recognizing him as the grieving brother who'd been searching for his missing sister. She asked what I was doing. Sam continued with chilling matter-of-factness. "I told her I was burying mementos of Maggie, that it helped with my grief. But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. She knew something was wrong." 3 days later, Linda Patterson disappeared during her routine evening walk. Her body was never found, though searchers combed the area for weeks. Sam had learned from Maggie's murder. Bodies were problems. Disappearances were puzzles without solutions. Dorothy Williams presented a different kind of threat in 1959. As a hospital administrator, she'd begun questioning discrepancies in medical supply inventories that traced back to Maggie's secret work. Her inquiries threatened to expose the underground network Sam had been exploiting for blackmail purposes. Dorothy was smart, methodical, Sam admitted. She'd figured out that supplies were disappearing during Maggie's shifts, that there was more to my sister's work than anyone realized. She started asking questions about patients who paid in cash, treatments that weren't officially recorded. Dorothy Williams died in what appeared to be a car accident on a lonely stretch of highway between Beaumont and Houston. Her vehicle had skidded off the road during what police determined was a sudden tire blowout. Sam's confession revealed that he'd loosened the lug nuts on her wheel, creating a delayed mechanical failure that would appear accidental. The third victim, Catherine "Kitty" Rodriguez, represented Sam's evolution as a killer. In 1962, she'd recognized him at a Houston gambling hall and approached him with dangerous knowledge. Kitty had been one of Maggie's patients, Sam explained. She remembered me from visits to the hospital, knew I was Maggie's brother. When she saw me gambling with large amounts of cash, she started asking questions about how a grieving brother could afford such expensive habits. Catherine Rodriguez vanished from her apartment, leaving behind a young child who would grow up wondering what happened to her mother. Sam had learned to make people disappear completely, erasing them from the world as if they'd never existed. Through psychological profiling and Sam's own admissions, experts identified his disturbing progression as a killer. Maggie's murder had been impulsive, driven by immediate financial pressure and sibling resentment. But subsequent killings became calculated and methodical. He developed techniques for making deaths appear accidental or like voluntary disappearances, learning to identify and eliminate threats before they could expose him. Sam's strategic relocation to Houston after leaving Beaumont revealed a sophisticated criminal mind. He'd used his knowledge of Maggie's patient network to identify vulnerable women in Houston's elite circles, expanding his blackmail operation beyond Beaumont's social boundaries. The women Maggie helped had sisters, friends, daughters who needed similar assistance. Sam explained with disturbing pride. I provided services and ensured their discretion through financial arrangements. When clients became problematic or threatened exposure, I solved those problems permanently. Sam had cultivated an image as a successful businessman, using blackmail proceeds to fund legitimate investments that provided cover for his criminal income. His gambling habit continued, but now he possessed a steady revenue source that didn't depend on luck or skill. Detective Santos faced unique challenges investigating crimes spanning multiple decades. Many witnesses were deceased or suffered memory loss that made their testimony unreliable. Physical evidence from the 1950s and 1960s was limited or contaminated by years of storage. Police procedures from that era had been less thorough than modern standards, and jurisdictional issues complicated coordination across multiple counties and time periods. Interviews with Sam's children revealed disturbing patterns they'd never understood. His son Robert described their father's unexplained wealth despite no apparent legitimate income source. Dad always had money for investments, real estate, family vacations, Robert said. But when we asked about his business, he'd get angry and change the subject. We learned not to ask questions. Sam's daughter Margaret recalled his obsessive control over family activities and social connections. He monitored our friendships, especially my relationships with other girls. If someone asked too many questions about our family, Dad would find reasons why we couldn't spend time with them anymore. Most disturbing were the business trips that coincided with some of the disappearances. Sam would leave town for several days, returning in improved moods that suggested successful completion of important tasks. Surviving relatives of Sam's victims finally had answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. Linda Patterson's sister had always suspected foul play but couldn't prove it. Dorothy Williams' son had questioned the circumstances of his mother's accident, never accepting that a careful driver would lose control on a familiar road. Catherine Rodriguez's daughter, now in her 60s, had spent her life wondering what happened to her mother. Modern forensic techniques provided new hope for identifying additional victims. GPS mapping of Houston area locations where Sam had lived and worked created geographic profiles of his activities. Database searches connected missing persons reports from the 1950s through 1970s, revealing patterns that earlier investigators couldn't have detected. As the investigation expanded, the true scope of Sam's crimes became apparent. At least 6 confirmed victims over a 15-year period, with potential involvement in additional disappearances across Texas. A sophisticated blackmail operation that had targeted dozens of women. Financial crimes including fraud, extortion, and money laundering that had funded decades of comfortable living. The revelations devastated multiple communities. Beaumont residents struggled to accept that they'd unknowingly lived alongside a serial killer for years. Houston's elite society faced exposure of decades-old secrets that could still destroy reputations and families. Law enforcement agencies across Texas began reopening cold cases for potential connections to Sam Collins. Serial killers often hide in plain sight for decades, appearing normal while harboring deadly secrets. Have you ever known someone who seemed perfectly ordinary but triggered unexplained unease? Those gut instincts sometimes detect dangers our conscious minds can't process, warning signals that might save lives if we learn to trust them. As Detective Santos reviewed files of potential additional victims, she discovered a connection that made her blood run cold. Among the missing persons reports from 1965, she found a letter written by a woman named Patricia Myers to her sister 3 days before she disappeared. The letter mentioned a man named Sam who'd been asking suspicious questions about women's health services and had offered to help with a delicate situation for a substantial fee. Patricia had felt uncomfortable about the meeting but needed the assistance he'd promised to provide. But the detail that stopped Santos' heart was the return address on the letter, 1247 Magnolia Street, Houston, the same street where Detective Santos lived today, just 3 houses down from her current address. Sam Collins had been operating in her neighborhood 60 years ago, and his criminal activities might have continued far longer than anyone had imagined. The possibility that she'd been living within walking distance of one of his crime scenes suggested that Sam's influence had shaped her world in ways she was only beginning to understand. The investigation was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning to reveal the true scope of a predator who'd spent 70 years perfecting the art of murder. At 89 years old, Sam Collins finally faced judgment. But in a courtroom filled with decades of pain, would justice truly be served? The Jefferson County Courthouse had never seen anything like the media circus that descended on Beaumont in March 2024. Satellite trucks lined the street, their antennas reaching toward gray Texas skies like mechanical prayers for justice. Court TV established a dedicated studio in a nearby hotel, while true crime podcasters conducted interviews from coffee shops and parking lots throughout the city. Inside the courthouse, spectators packed every available seat. The story had captured national attention as one of the longest delayed justice cases in American history, a 68-year gap between crime and trial that challenged conventional understanding of accountability and time. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh faced the monumental task of prosecuting a murder that occurred before many of her own grandparents were born. At 43, she'd built her career on complex cases, but nothing had prepared her for the unique challenges of trying a defendant who was older than most physical evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh began her opening statement. We're here because DNA doesn't lie, and neither do the dead. Maggie Collins has been waiting 68 years for someone to speak for her. Today, that voice belongs to you. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 2 weeks. DNA evidence linking Sam to blood on Maggie's uniform provided scientific foundation that 1955 investigators could never have imagined. Walsh played recordings of Sam's confession, his voice filling the courtroom with admissions that chilled spectators to silence. Circumstantial evidence from Detective Wheeler's original files painted a picture of suspicious behavior that had seemed meaningless in 1955 but gained sinister significance in light of Sam's confession. Financial records showed his sudden improvement in circumstances after Maggie's disappearance. Gambling debts paid off, investment properties purchased, a lifestyle that exceeded any legitimate income source. The defense strategy required delicate navigation of an impossible situation. Court-appointed attorney Marcus Thompson, a veteran defender with 30 years' experience, had never faced a case where his client had confessed to multiple murders spanning decades. Sam Collins is an 89-year-old man whose mind has been shaped by guilt and medication, Thompson argued during his opening statement. He's confessing to crimes to give meaning to his final years, seeking attention and importance he never achieved in life. Thompson questioned the reliability of memories from 7 decades past, challenged the chain of custody for physical evidence stored since 1955, and portrayed Sam as a frail old man who posed no threat to society. He suggested that prosecuting someone so elderly was more about vengeance than justice. The trial's most powerful moments came during victim impact statements. The courtroom fell silent as family members spoke about lives forever altered by Sam's crimes. Margaret Collins' great-niece, Jennifer Collins Martinez, addressed the court with trembling voice. "My family grew up with stories about Aunt Maggie, the angel who disappeared. We carried her memory like a sacred flame, never knowing that the person who lit candles at her memorial services was the same man who had extinguished her life." Linda Patterson's nephew, now in his 70s, described decades of wondering what happened to his aunt. "Every time someone went missing, every time we heard about another tragedy, we wondered if it was connected to Aunt Linda. The not knowing was a special kind of torture that lasted our entire lives." Catherine Rodriguez's daughter provided the most heartbreaking testimony. At 62, Maria Rodriguez Santos spoke through tears about growing up without her mother. "I used to stand at my bedroom window, watching for her to come home. I did that for years, believing she might return. Now I know she never could." Expert testimony anchored the prosecution's case in scientific reality. Forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Chun explained serial killer behavior patterns, describing how Sam's crimes fit established psychological profiles. DNA expert Dr. Robert Kim walked the jury through genetic evidence with visual presentations that made complex science accessible. Professor Mary Williams provided historical context about 1950s social conditions, helping jurors understand the environment that had allowed Sam's crimes to remain hidden. Cold case expert Detective Lieutenant James Morrison explained investigative techniques that connected evidence across decades. Against his lawyer's advice, Sam insisted on testifying. His appearance on the witness stand provided the trial's most chilling moments. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit that emphasized his frail frame, Sam showed no remorse, only irritation at being caught after so many years. "Maggie forced my hand," he testified with disturbing calm. "She could have helped us both, but she chose to be stubborn. Everything that happened after was her choice, not mine." When Prosecutor Walsh asked about his other victims, Sam's expression shifted to something resembling pride. "I survived for 68 years without being caught. That takes intelligence, planning, and adaptability. Most killers get sloppy and get caught within months." The media coverage transformed the trial into a cultural phenomenon. True crime enthusiasts traveled from across the country to attend proceedings. Social media platforms exploded with theories and commentary about each day's testimony. Documentary filmmakers negotiated for exclusive rights, while Beaumont experienced an influx of dark tourism, visitors who wanted to see locations connected to the crimes. The trial also served as community reckoning for Beaumont. Support groups formed for families of cold case victims, providing forums for shared grief and healing. The city held memorial services for all of Sam's victims, finally acknowledging their lives and honoring their memories. Baptist Hospital established the Margaret Collins Scholarship for nursing students who demonstrated commitment to serving underserved populations. Discussion began about creating a memorial to honor victims of unsolved crimes throughout East Texas. Jury deliberation lasted 3 days as 12 citizens wrestled with evidence spanning 7 decades. They faced difficult decisions about weighing testimony from elderly witnesses, considering Sam's age and health in potential sentencing, and determining guilt beyond reasonable doubt using largely circumstantial evidence. Foreman Patricia Hendricks later described the deliberation as the most difficult moral challenge any of us had ever faced. The jury understood they were deciding not just Sam's fate, but setting precedent for how the justice system handles cases where time has eroded traditional evidence while amplifying emotional impact. On March 28, 2024, the jury returned their verdict. The courtroom held its collective breath as Hendricks stood to deliver their decision. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Margaret Collins. Guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Linda Patterson. Guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Dorothy Williams. Guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Catherine Rodriguez. Additional guilty verdicts followed for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy charges. The jury recommended life in prison without possibility of parole, along with special findings about the aggravated nature of the crimes. Judge Patricia Rivera delivered sentencing with words that resonated throughout the packed courtroom. Mr. Collins, you have spent 68 years evading justice, but justice does not have an expiration date. While this sentence comes too late for your victims to see, it serves as recognition that their lives mattered and their deaths will be remembered. Justice delayed, but not denied. What do you think about trying elderly defendants for decades-old crimes? Should age be a factor in punishment when the crimes themselves transcend time? The questions raised by Sam's trial challenged fundamental assumptions about accountability, mercy, and the meaning of justice itself. As bailiffs led Sam away in handcuffs, he turned toward Detective Santos with eyes that held no fear, only cold calculation. His final words carried across the silent courtroom like a curse. You think this ends it, but there are more. There are always more. And some of them learned from me. Santos felt ice form in her veins as she realized the horrifying implication. Sam Collins might have influenced other killers during his decades of freedom, teaching methods and sharing knowledge that created a legacy of violence extending far beyond his own crimes. The trial was over, but Sam's final revelation suggested that his true impact on the world might be just beginning to surface. Some stories end with justice served. Others reveal that the truth, once uncovered, opens doors to even darker mysteries that may never be fully solved. 6 months after Sam Collins' conviction, the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville received a call that Detective Santos had been expecting yet dreading. Sam Collins had died peacefully in his sleep at the prison medical facility, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to his grave. Santos drove the 3 hours to Huntsville that same afternoon, arriving as prison officials prepared to transfer Sam's body to the county morgue. She'd made this trip twice before during his brief incarceration, hoping to extract additional information about victims or accomplices. Each visit had yielded fragments of truth mixed with manipulation, as Sam seemed to enjoy parceling out revelations like playing cards in a game only he understood. During their final conversation just 2 weeks earlier, Sam had offered what might have been his closest approach to genuine reflection. Lying in the prison hospital bed, oxygen tubes threading beneath his nose, he'd looked older than his 89 years. Maggie was special, you know, he told Santos, his voice barely above a whisper. She really did help people. If I could do it over. He'd paused then, his eyes focusing on something beyond the institutional walls. Santos had leaned forward, hoping for actual remorse, perhaps even an apology that could provide some measure of closure for the families. Instead, Sam's expression had shifted to that familiar cold smile. I'd have been more careful about the evidence. Even facing death, Sam Collins showed no genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. The multi-agency task force Santos now led had expanded to include investigators from 5 counties and 2 FBI field offices. Sam's claims about additional victims had opened investigative pathways that stretched across decades and state lines. Cold case files from across Texas were being reviewed for potential connections to his methods, timeline, and geographic movements. Advanced DNA analysis continued on evidence from unsolved disappearances dating back to the 1950s. Genealogical databases that had helped identify Sam were now being used to potentially identify additional victims through family connections. Behavioral analysts worked to create profiles of possible protégés or copycat killers who might have learned from Sam's techniques. The investigation had already yielded disturbing discoveries. Financial records revealed a blackmail operation more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, spanning 3 decades and involving dozens of victims across multiple states. Letters found among Sam's personal effects hinted at accomplices who had never been identified, references to business partners, and mutual interests that suggested a network rather than a lone killer. Most chilling were the hand-drawn maps found in Sam's prison cell, locations marked with cryptic symbols that led search teams to 2 additional burial sites. The remains discovered there belonged to women who had been missing since the 1960s, their disappearances attributed to voluntary departures or accidents until Sam's maps revealed the truth. Research into Maggie's secret work had unveiled a broader historical context that transformed understanding of 1950s social dynamics. Dozens of women across East Texas had been secretly helping other women access medical care that official channels denied them. A loose network had existed among progressive nurses, midwives, and sympathetic doctors who risked their careers and freedom to provide essential services. Many of these women had faced threats, harassment, and violence for their activities. Several mysterious disappearances from the 1950s through 1970s might be connected to this underground network, suggesting that Sam's targeting of Maggie represented part of a larger pattern of violence against women who challenged social conventions. As the full scope of Maggie's work emerged, her legacy underwent profound transformation. Medical historians began recognizing her as part of an important civil rights movement that preceded more famous activism by decades. Women's health advocates cited her as an early hero of reproductive rights, someone who'd paid the ultimate price for defending women's autonomy over their own bodies. The Maggie Collins Foundation, established with donations from across the country, now provided healthcare access to underserved women throughout East Texas. Baptist Hospital had created a memorial garden honoring healthcare workers who'd risked everything to help others, with Maggie's name inscribed on a granite monument surrounded by healing herbs and flowering plants. The case had revolutionized cold case investigation practices throughout Texas. The state legislature allocated funding for a dedicated cold case DNA database, while new protocols emerged for preserving evidence from unsolved crimes. Training programs now taught investigators to look for serial patterns in seemingly unrelated cases, understanding that some killers operated for decades without detection. Victim advocacy groups had gained stronger voices in the justice system, with family members like Maria Rodriguez Santos becoming powerful speakers for cold case reform and victim rights legislation. Beaumont struggled with its newfound notoriety in ways that divided the community along generational lines. Some residents embraced the attention, organizing true crime tours and historical events that brought tourism revenue to the struggling oil town. Others felt exploited by the media circus and murder tourism that transformed their community's tragedy into entertainment. Older residents who remembered 1955 often expressed discomfort with the sensationalized coverage, while younger people fascinated by the story saw opportunity for economic development and cultural identity. The case had sparked community discussions about how to handle dark histories, whether to commemorate, commercialize, or simply acknowledge the past. The families most directly affected by Sam's crimes had responded in varied ways to the resolution and ongoing revelations. Sam's children continued struggling with shame and confusion, seeking therapy to process the discovery that their father was a serial killer. His daughter Margaret had legally changed her name and relocated to escape the notoriety that followed the family. Victim families expressed gratitude for closure while lamenting that justice had come too late for their loved ones to witness. Support groups had formed to help families of other cold case victims, providing forums for shared grief and advocacy for systemic changes in how unsolved crimes were investigated. Women who had received Maggie's help, along with their descendants, began speaking publicly for the first time in decades. These testimonies honored Maggie's memory while advocating for continued healthcare access and reproductive rights. Despite Sam's conviction and death, significant mysteries remained unanswered. The identity of Dr. H., mentioned in Maggie's diary, continued to elude investigators. Were there living accomplices who had helped Sam evade justice for so many years? How many additional victims remained undiscovered in unmarked graves across Texas? Most troubling was the question of whether other serial killers had learned from Sam's methods, carrying forward techniques that allowed decades of undetected killing. His final warning about others who had learned from him suggested a legacy of violence that extended beyond his own crimes. Detective Santos, now promoted to head the state's new cold case task force, reflected on the ongoing nature of seeking justice during a recent interview. Sam Collins is gone, but his victims deserve more than just his conviction. Every cold case represents someone's mother, sister, daughter, someone who mattered. Maggie Collins showed us that one person's courage to help others can echo through generations. Our job is to make sure that echo reaches every victim still waiting for justice. The story of Maggie Collins reminds us that evil can hide behind familiar faces, but it also demonstrates that truth possesses power that transcends time. If this case has moved you, consider supporting cold case investigations in your community. Share this story, because somewhere, someone might possess information that could solve another decades-old mystery. Remember that heroes like Maggie Collins prove ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, even when it costs them everything. On a golden October afternoon, exactly 68 years after Maggie's disappearance, Detective Santos visited the Tyler Cemetery where Maggie's remains had finally been laid to rest beside her parents. The headstone, purchased through donations from people who'd never known Maggie but were inspired by her story, read, Margaret Maggie Collins, 1927 to 1955. Beloved daughter, sister, nurse. She died helping others live. As Santos placed white roses on the grave, a young woman approached carrying nursing textbooks. She introduced herself as Emily Santos Martinez, a descendant of one of the women Maggie had helped in 1955, a family line that existed because of Maggie's courage. I'm starting nursing school next month, Emily explained, on a scholarship from the Maggie Collins Foundation. My great-grandmother always told us about the angel nurse who saved her life, but we never knew her name until now. The cemetery stretched peaceful and eternal under the Texas sky, proof that truth, justice, and healing could emerge even from the darkest crimes. While evil might triumph temporarily, the courage to seek truth and help others created legacies that outlasted any criminal's attempts to bury the past. Subscribe to our channel if you believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, every family deserves answers, and every mystery deserves someone willing to keep searching for the truth. Because in the end, that's how we honor heroes like Maggie Collins, by never giving up on justice, no matter how long it takes. The story was complete, but the search for truth continued. Somewhere in Texas, other cold cases waited for their Detective Santos, other families waited for answers, and other heroes like Maggie Collins waited for recognition. Justice might be delayed, but it would never be denied as long as people refused to let the voices of the dead fall silent.